think quite exciting to see that some of us have also started publishing methodologically oriented papers. And I like to think that that's kind of spurred on by some of the discussions that we've had in this journal club. So welcome to everyone online. And we've got Salia, Joanne, and Nancy in person here with us as well. So this morning's paper was one that I came across recently. I was looking for something to do with ethics. And it really did turn out to be quite a meaty paper. And I think it links quite nicely to some of the other discussions that we've had this year and even last year around ethical issues in qualitative research, because there are no hard and fast rules. There's no cookie cutter approach, and it's all very, very sensitive and a lot of unintended consequences that can arise from this kind of research. So this article seemed quite opportune. So the author starts with a quote that she took from a colleague of hers, a historian, who said, tongue-in-cheek, I prefer my historical sources to be well and truly dead and unable to talk back. And I guess, yes, life would be a lot easier if we did that kind of research. But that is not the kind of research that makes for really deep, meaningful qualitative work. I think a lot of the joy and the enrichment that we get from doing qualitative work is from engaging with participants, doing work in communities, hard as it is to do that. So as always, I'm going to go through some slides, and please feel free to put up a hand, pop a comment in the chat, or just talk and contribute to the conversation. Would you want to come and sit here and just share slides? Yeah. So we have a special ethical relationship. Morning, Rona. So they start off this article by talking about the special relationship that we have with what they term sources or narrators, which is also a new term for me. You know, I think we often think of our participants just as participants, but here they're talking about them as narrators. And Joe, I think that probably aligns quite nicely with your work on narrative, to actually see them as a narrator, as someone telling a story rather than just a participant or a source, but somebody who shares their lives with us. And they talk about this very important distinction between explicit ethics, which is really what you have to do to satisfy the ethics committee's requirements, versus subtle ethics, which is what actually happens in terms of the unofficial aspects of qualitative research and how ethics works its way kind of on the ground as you are conducting your research. So they also talk in this article, and the strong focus of this article is really around what to do with potential distress or real distress that might arise, or what they term unexpected trauma. And they talk about and frame it as anytime you're interviewing someone about their private details or their private life, that means you're going to be probing into areas that might be sensitive, that might be tricky for them to talk about. And it means heightened ethical responsibility. So we really need to think very carefully going into it about what kind of trauma might we expect versus what might be unexpected. And that's sometimes hard to do. And I know even as an ethics committee chair, often we'll look at a study and have different opinions in the meetings around, is this potentially distressing or not? And it's sometimes very hard to judge. And as some of us know, sometimes you'll be interviewing someone about a fairly innocuous topic and they can show signs of distress. So it's very hard to predict. And I guess the article is really about what does one do when one deals with this unexpected trauma. I like the point that they made as well around being the subject of research really changes your own understanding of your experiences. So, and that links it quite nicely to one of the previous Journal Club articles where we talked about this notion of your experiences are not packaged in a nice little box for people to access. It's actually something that you almost construct and work through during an interview. And I know from personal experience, sometimes being part of an interview can really change and shift the way that you perceive the particular phenomenon that you're talking about, or your own recollection of it, or your own orientation to what you are discussing. And I think that that's quite important to think about going into an interview, that this is not just accessing nice, neat experiences in a box. So what they talk about, and I put a nice little table together here, is different types of distress. So expected trauma, where you know that there's a risk. So you know that the topic is sensitive, or you know that the kinds of questions you're asking are going to probe into potentially tricky spaces emotionally. And that you can prepare for. So we would put distress protocols in place. And you really need to think, what are you going to do in the interview if someone starts showing distress? How are you going to, where are you going to refer them? What will you do? But the article is really about the unexpected trauma. So about research with topics that are laden with personal significance, where powerful and unexpected emotions and distress may surface, or where they talk about distress being subtle, internal, and often only manifesting after the interview. So a reference to the title of the paper, which talks about the afterlife of the interview, which I think is quite a nice way of putting it. And I know that ties in quite nicely with some of the discussions that we've had on various projects. Megan, I'm thinking of yours, and Siobhan, I'm thinking of your work as well, where the distress has been not only necessarily with participants, but also with the researcher, and trying to navigate what you're seeing. Jo, I'm also thinking of your your PhD research, which was just sometimes so hard to read the data.
No.
It's very, very hard data to process. So what they offered in the article was a couple of questions which I thought were quite key to think about in relation to the work that one is doing in a particular project. So firstly, what is the impact of the interview upon the narrator? Can the interview offer healing and or closure? And again, that's a difficult one to predict, because you don't necessarily know how talking about the experience might kind of change and shift perceptions for the narrator. Can we harm the narrator through an insensitive response? And sure, that's quite a big one. I think sometimes we have this idea that qualitative research is not too difficult. And then you come across a question like this, like, wow, you can actually cause harm through an interview. And then I'm thinking, what are the implications even for sending students off to do research where there's potential for causing harm? Yeah, very tricky. What should the interviewer do when confronted with distress? What are their responsibilities post-interview? And I think the question that's missing here perhaps is, what is the impact of the interview on the researcher? Because that is not mentioned there. So I don't know if anybody has thoughts at this stage about these questions.
Well, I was just going to add, because in thinking about a lot of the applications, that the ethics applications that we review,
Yeah.
and a lot of the time the research is being done as part of a bigger team, and there's going to be some research assistant who's going to be trained. And I think that's when there's real risk for both parties.
Yeah,
where
because
you're
you
going to
have no
send somebody
idea.
out, because I don't like those where it just says like name of interviewer. I mean, you've got a whole 5 or 6 different research assistants who are ostensibly trained, but
And as we know, I'm just thinking back to some of Claire's research years ago, where she was looking at HIV pediatric care, and then only afterwards, when she'd had the interviews transcribed and translated, she discovered that the research assistant had asked all sorts of things in a strange way, like, you and I know these doctors are awful, but let's just answer these questions for the research, and completely skewed the whole data collection process. Yeah, so yeah, one doesn't know how they're responding, or what ideas they're bringing, and how they might be shifting an interview in a particular direction, or else how are they handling or not handling the emotional responses of that participant. Yeah.
I'm thinking this is actually something that the HREC should actually look into, because I mean, I can't think of all the research I've done. I can't think of one time I've actually had to refer someone for counseling in that moment. And yet you have to do a lot of scurrying around to get a counselor and an
Yeah.
agreement and whatever. But I wonder how often those referrals are made, because I think probably the need is greater after once the interview's happened
Yes.
and then there's no contact with the researcher
Yeah.
anymore.
And that participant is sitting there thinking to themselves, I wish I hadn't said that, or why did I disclose that? Yeah.
Yeah. Or I didn't realize I actually felt this way about whatever.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's something that can sit with
Yeah.
you for a long time.
Yeah.
I think that's a very valid point. And I'm thinking also back to a presentation that I think it was Catherine Bain and another colleague from psychology did at one of our ethics days. And I'm going to scratch out those notes and I'll circulate them, because what their claim was that is, from a psychological point of view, distress is not always necessarily a bad thing. So someone can be crying in an interview, and it's not necessarily that they are completely distraught and traumatized. And so how do you know also what kind of distress is okay or not? I see Megan's got a comment here. She agrees the research assistants and interpreters often are not considered in guidelines and distress protocols. Santo, I see you've got your hand up. Do you want to chip in here?
Yes, I guess just also adding on Megan's comment about the researchers. I was wondering if, when you're applying for ethics, they usually ask if you've done any training. The training that you get that then allows you to apply for ethics. If that training does enough on the distress or emotional side of awareness when you're doing research, I feel that it focuses more on the technicalities of working with human participants, instead of also how do you take care of you, the researcher, but also the researchers in terms of distress. Yeah.
Yeah, good point, Santo. And yeah, we can say definitely it doesn't address that. Certainly the tree training, which is the one that the medical ethics subscribes, and a lot of people use it for non-medical as well, is very just procedural and paper-based. It doesn't really cover these nitty-gritties of really how does one deal with this kind of thing. And I don't know, also coming back to my point about students, how does one get to a point where one is able to do this kind of work in a very deep way? I'm going to shift across to Siobhan. Do you want to chip in here? Just going to close the door.
I was wondering if anybody here has had people like contact them after participation because they were distressed. Wondering if that's like if anybody has experience of that, because like our details are on the information sheets and stuff, and I'm just wondering, like, I'm on how, I guess, to encourage people to do that if they are distressed, or if they've, and how would they feel that it was helpful to speak to the researcher again? Maybe they don't, maybe they feel like it's helpful to speak to somebody else. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point, but yeah, from experience, I've never had anybody do that. But I think we also need to consider the power dynamics at play in the researcher participant relationship, because if you've been interviewed and you have feelings afterwards, or you're feeling distressed, are you necessarily going to feel strong enough or brave enough to contact the researcher? Or are you going to sit there and feel like, well, maybe this is just me, maybe I'm the idiot here? Yeah. So I don't know if they necessarily would. I'm thinking though, Siobhan, of the participant who contacted you and asked to have a recording of the interview, which was also a very unusual request that we had to discuss and chat about.
At the interview.
Mm.
Yeah, but he asked at the interview. And that's also somebody that, because I was interviewing people, it's also people that I have an ongoing relationship with. So I would imagine with them, like with one of my participants in that particular study, because I work closely with that unit and I have ongoing relationships with those people, one of them said afterwards, that it was quite heavy for her. She didn't like, it was like at a later date, like I was asking one of the other members of the team, are you available for an interview now? And then the other participant who had done it with before, she said, oh, it was very heavy. You must, I found it quite tiring.
Sure.
But she didn't kind of say, you know, I wish I hadn't done it, or, you know, anything like that, or, you know, and I think also something that I said to all of them was that if there's anything that, you know, you don't want me to use, you can let me know. It's all obviously confidential and all of that. Like it's your information. But I think that having that ongoing relationship with them makes them more willing to give that feedback. Whereas, like, I think about my other study with participants at Barra who I only met for the interview, and then, you know, we did follow-up interviews, and some of them gave feedback at the follow-up interview about the first interview. But if we hadn't done that, I don't know that they ever would have contacted us and said, like, oh, this was really helpful, or this was really, or I really don't want to do this, that was really upsetting to do it, or, you know, yeah, how do we encourage people to tell us these things, I guess.
And then even if they do, like in that instance where the participants said, oh, this was such a heavy interview, does one intervene and follow up with them? Or do you just leave it and wait for them to come back to you? It's really tricky to know what's the right thing to do, I guess, in that scenario.
Yeah.
I think they also make the point that, you know, the narrator has agency too. And they can decide whether they want to share or not. And you as a researcher have no idea at the point that they make in the article whether they've told you everything. And, you know, I think there's that side as well, that it's not only, it's almost arrogant to assume that we're going to pause everything, but they've also got agency in terms of how and what they share. But I think even with that, just because they don't verbally share it doesn't mean that you haven't triggered that thought process. So I'm just looking at the second question here about healing and closure, and a lot of certainly the older qualitative research does talk about that you know, it's like it's a you offering them a service by giving them a chance to tell their story. And I think we have to be very careful of, and I've written that before because I thought, but you don't know what happens after the interview. It's convenient.
No. Yeah, I've certainly had experiences with focus groups, particularly where participants have said, can we do this again? This was so helpful. So yes, I think sometimes there is healing and closure, but one cannot assume that is always the case. Because as you say, Jo, you know, sometimes maybe it triggers a thought process that we don't know about. And then this person's sitting there trying to work through that and doesn't feel able to reach out and ask for assistance. And then the whole other question, and that's a whole other discussion, is it necessarily appropriate just to send someone off to a psychologist?
Yeah.
Is that, you know, is that helpful? Is that appropriate for that participant in that community, in that context, or not? Yeah, tricky sometimes.
Or to send them back to the social worker at the hospital where the trauma may have occurred in the first place. I mean, often that is your...
Exactly. Yeah. Carl, do you want to chip in here?
Thanks for interesting discussion. Just one or two observations from a clinical side in terms of seeing patients, and then also in the interviews that I've done so far. Patients are always quite surprised when I say something like, you can always come back and tell me if you're not okay. They always feel like, oh, I wasn't sure if I could, or I wasn't sure. And then you know, from personally, I know, like, when you're feeling frustrated or like confused, one tends to think, let me not bother people with my insanity or my crazy thoughts or my like confusion. I'm just probably not getting it. So I think it's important to highlight that to participants. And then the other thing I think it's just becomes complicated when you do an interview from, it's a relationship as well. So you can't just step away. Like it's nice, we would like it to be like that, but ultimately when you open the door and you have that interaction and you go into somebody's deep situation, you've started a relationship, so you have to kind of then be available for yourself and for them, which is not necessarily always convenient, but yeah, it opens up a whole lot of interesting things. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. I think those are such interesting points, especially if you've got an ongoing relationship with patients in a clinic, for example, where they can come back and access you. But I like your point about making this explicit for participants and actually saying, it's okay if you have further thoughts or you want to chat a bit more about it, or it triggers something, or you need somebody to chat to. And kind of normalizing that, because otherwise, yes, I think that person would sit and think, maybe I am the only idiot here, or maybe, it's just me.
You navigate that in a time restricted research.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to do that, to avail yourself, or, to make that time available.
I hear you, absolutely, yeah. And I see Siobhan's comment as well, saying that sometimes going to a psychologist or coming back to see the researcher would cost time and money, which is not necessarily something that everybody can do. Exactly. Yeah, I think it's really, really difficult to think around these things, but it's something we need to engage with in relation to what is the nature of the project, what is the nature of the relationship I have with the participants as well. So is this a once-off with fairly innocuous questions, or is this something deeper that requires more of a relationship to be initiated, opened, established?
And allowed ethically to have a further relationship after the interview to...
Well, I think the fact that you give them your contact details means that they should be able to contact you if they have queries or further issues that they want to discuss. So that door is definitely open, and the door is also open for them to contact the ethics committee too. So I think by actually including that information on the participant information sheet, you are opening that door and saying a relationship is there potentially, and you may contact me if you need to. Yeah.
What I'm struck with was within this article is then sending them the transcript. So that I thought was wow. So it's absolutely getting the feedback afterwards, saying I will correct anything that you think is a mistake.
Yeah.
So, I mean, first of all, you wouldn't be able to send them a CA transcript. They'd give up on 3 lines. These academics are hard.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point, Rona. I mean, that is
something. I don't know anybody who's done that.
So I had a student, a 4th-year student, who did send the transcripts back. But it was quite an innocuous study asking about volunteer experiences in stroke support groups. And she got just irritated responses like, I don't have time to look through the transcript. So I guess it depends on the type of project. But yes, you can choose to send your transcripts to someone. Yeah.
Well, it's a bit like those discussions we've had in our qualitative research group on co-analysis and how difficult it is to get people who you've interviewed to come back and give of their time and take part in the co-analysis.
Yeah, because I think for a lot of participants, it's a case of, well, I've given you what you want. I've participated. That's it. And I know I certainly, as a research participant, have been very irritated when I've taken part in an interview, I've given my time, and then I get follow-ups. Please fill in this survey. Please, can we look at this? Please. Like, no, I'm done. You've had the interview. You've had my time. No more.
It's that sign of bothering somebody. How's the experience of this call? Like, just
I'm not doing a survey.
Yes. I'm not going to fill it in if I'm fine. If I'm really angry and I think that there's some recourse, then I will. So I think you get a skewed perspective.
Absolutely.
But then the other thing is, and I think this is what they're saying is one of the big safeguards, is to feel that they are part of a greater purpose, especially if they've felt shared something personal. So then seeing the transcripts and seeing the finished product is actually
kind of important.
Yeah.
Not that anybody, like many people read research.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. Does anybody read all of this that
Yeah,
you spend hours and hours putting together?
Which adjective?
Yes, exactly. So they do talk about in the article the difference between an in-depth interview and therapy, and this concept of interviews can have positive emotional impact, but questioning also, is it revelation, epiphany, or process of healing, or is it re-traumatization? And do we have a scenario where we actively decide not to probe painful stories? And that was one of the previous journal clubs that we did, where we discussed that article around the sort of colonial approach of I want to probe your story because it's interesting and it's traumatic, and that's the kind of thing that people want to read, versus actively saying I'm not going to do that. And then how does one pursue valid research? So many questions to ask around these tricky, sensitive topics. So what they talk about, which I quite liked, was this concept of a sensitively conductive interview. And I think there's a whole discussion around how one gets to that point where you're able to conduct a sensitive interview. But protecting the interests of the participants should always triumph over the pursuit of knowledge. And never take for granted that there is a gifting and a trust inherent. So what Carl was saying about relationship, there's a gifting of my story, my experience, and I expect as a participant that you as researcher will actually hold that, look after it, treat it with respect. And then they went back to the ethics of care framework, Tronto's work, which is a theoretical framework that we really have used a lot in the HCRU. But they applied it to research, which was very interesting. So thinking about the caring obligations of researchers, thinking about how we make ethical decisions contextually. So conceptualizing the community, the participants within community and context. And they talk about relational ethics, which is really lovely. So that relationship aspect again, with ethics at the heart of the research process, and across the research process as well. So how does one navigate that relationship from recruitment to beyond the afterlife of the interview? Yeah. So then they had some suggestions of before, during, and after interviews, what to think about. So the before bit. Kim, do you want to pop in here?
I'm reflecting about what you said about actually the emotional maturity that a researcher should have when approaching topics, looking at the sensitivity of all this. And I'm just thinking about like our undergraduate cohort, and maybe they're very new to research, they're very new to therapy in general. So I'm just kind of wondering then how you, because I obviously have to start somewhere, but then I'm just thinking about how maybe our job is as supervisors would be to prepare them adequately for this kind of situation, to ensure that they are sensitive when conducting interviews.
And
I guess, I never thought about it, but yeah, it's something maybe I need to think of when telling them how to do it, depending on the topic, but still.
Yeah, and I think the topic is the key here, because we would steer them away from tricky topics. I remember years ago, I had a fourth year who wanted to go and interview moms in a NICU. I was like, no, you're not doing that, because that particular student, I did not feel had the kind of maturity level that would be that would not be a good idea. But then this year I had a student who was actually a really mature student, at fourth year level, who looked into experiences of speech therapists breaking bad news or giving a diagnosis. And she ended up doing such a beautiful, meaningful, deep, rich project. And I allowed her to run with it because I felt, okay, she can cope with it. She'd shown me in the proposal process that she'd really approached it with a lot of sensitivity. So I guess it's also kind of gauging the student. Sure. And steering them away from topics where we think, oh gosh, not a good idea. I mean, it does concern us even on the ethics committee. Occasionally we'll get an application from someone who's doing research for the first time, and it's like a higher risk sensitive topic, and you could see they've had no training, no experience, and you think, oh gosh, not a good idea.
Yeah.
But Kim, I think maybe one thing that really can assist is ensuring that they do a pilot study, even if it's not with that exact same population. So they need to practice that skill of interviewing among their classmates or whatever, and then a pilot. So it's they develop incrementally rather than just saying, okay, take your interview guide and off you go and interview your participants.
Yeah, I think that's really important, or even practicing with them.
Yeah.
You know, I've sometimes, I usually try and have a meeting with students before they go off and collect research. Sometimes they just go off by themselves, and then I think, oh gosh. But generally, I will have a meeting with them and chat about, how are you going to do this? How are you going to deal with any distress if that pops up? And actually getting them to kind of rehearse, and as Jo has suggested, do some sort of a pilot. Yeah.
We can even use simulations in teaching research skills.
Absolutely.
Cool,
That could be quite
thanks.
interesting. Yeah.
Exactly.
Very good suggestion. Siobhan, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to what Kim's bringing up. I'm wondering whether, as a supervisor, you ever listen to a recording of one of your students' interviews, especially like with a pilot or something, and look for places where they might need more guidance or.
Occasionally, yeah. What I've usually done, though, is a very thorough discussion with them about what happened, how did it go, and get their reflection on what they did. I think the tension is always the time factor. That much as I'd love to sit and spend that kind of time looking through a transcript or listening to an interview, it's actually very difficult to do. So, Siobhan, was one of your projects recently. That was actually the first time that I'd given that much time to actually sitting and going through and giving tips on how to improve, or where I thought there could be something done a bit differently. And that was primarily also because I think we've got a vested interest in actually turning that into something
Yes.
like a reflexive piece.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is something that we need to consider. How do we build that into the supervision process to make sure that there are those spaces for engaging with these kind of tricky issues? Yeah, so thanks for that point. Sarah, do you want to pop in here?
Yeah, I think with my students, I do listen to their pilot, and then I give them written feedback on their pilot. And then depending on where they're at, we sometimes do a mock interview between the two of us. And then I stop them at questions and ask them to reflect on how do they think that came across. And then maybe I'm maybe I'm spending too much time with them. And then I always say to them they're allowed to conduct one interview, and then they have to come back to supervision. And really it's because I think sometimes for some of the students that haven't gone through like therapy skills, or maybe are doing a dissertation, research dissertation, the stories can be quite a lot to sit with. And I think they're excited to get the research over, but they don't actually know what they're going to sit with. And I think sometimes that student debriefing or researcher debriefing has been quite useful in seeing the shift then in their actual approach to research. But that's just something I kind of gained from my own supervisor and kind of carried it on in my space.
I think that's lovely, and your students are very lucky to have you because that's what we should all be doing, is really guiding them on that kind of level. I think the point is really around how does one build in these opportunities for reflection and discussion. What's popping up in your interview, what struck you as unusual or unexpected, how did you manage it, how did you feel, and encouraging them also to keep research journals and diaries to document these kind of feelings. Yeah, so thanks for that. So they've got some points here on before the interview, and primarily focusing on procedural ethics, so the groundwork for ethics. They refer to it as explicit ethics, so getting your approval, putting all of these documents together, thinking about and trying to anticipate what you might come across in the interviews. And then they talked quite interestingly about recruitment. And so how does one invite participants? And this fine line between giving too much information, like I want to sit with you and talk about these deep issues, which might scare someone off. So versus not actually giving them enough information about what might happen. And Megan, I'm thinking of your project with the recordings of genetic counseling sessions where you as researcher knew this is going to be difficult, but weren't able to actually give that information ahead of the consent, to say, you know, Mom, this is actually going to be a tricky discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It put me in a very difficult ethical spot.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and how much is too much information or too little? So all these little details, I guess, that one has to try and think through and prepare for. So during the interview, they talk about the need to handle emotional distress. So thinking about things even like where the interview takes place, who's conducting it, how is the interview being done? And that was quite an interesting distinction that they made between what happens in someone's home versus in a workplace. You're going to answer quite differently depending on the environment. And just thinking about how sometimes we do interviews in our clinical spaces and how does that impact participants? Do they feel more comfortable or less comfortable? Is it a familiar place? Is it a place where they feel cared for, or is it a place that makes them feel uncomfortable? Thinking about power dynamics, that the researchers armed with knowledge and training and equipment, and the narrators armed only with memories and experiences, and how that dynamic is always there, that power dynamic. Thinking also about, and that, Rona, this was your point, ways in which narrators assert authority to share or withhold information. But then the point that Joe made about how we don't know what thought processes have been triggered, even if information wasn't shared. Does one abandon topics that elicit strong emotions? Yeah, I don't know if anybody's ever had a situation where a participant really showed signs of distress in an interview. I can't think that I've experienced that myself.
I'm just thinking about also during my PhD, that interview that I nearly left out, but it ended up being the most important interview because nothing was said, and the participant had said she wanted to take part, and the interviewer was trying to interview her, but she just couldn't verbalize. And that's where what Arthur Frank talks about, that the narrative is actually in the holes of what is not said rather than what is said.
Yeah.
So, but it wasn't like overt distress, crying, whatever. It was just she was unable to articulate her trauma and her experience.
Sure.
I had one now with the Parkinson's, and the participant expressed very strong suicidal ideation. Actually, not just ideation, intent. And it was very tricky, and we have a distress protocol in place, which I followed. But I think that the likelihood of the participant following the distress protocol is very unlikely, given the background, etc. So it is a very difficult situation to be in, because it was very explicit in the way that the participant said, like, they're not coping and etc. So yeah,
and not necessarily something that you could have predicted in that study.
Absolutely,
you know that they have Parkinson's, and that is a difficult condition to cope with. But to have someone actually verbalize that in an interview is very difficult. So I guess they are under the care of the neurologist. But then, does one disclose what's being talked about?
Yeah, so we didn't do that because of the confidentiality. So we had to follow the distress protocol that we had in place and our ethics and yeah. So,
but as you say, you can refer as much as you like, and you don't know.
But I know that he didn't, follow through with the distress protocol, which is hard.
Very, very difficult, and almost adds a burden to you as researcher.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Siobhan, do you want to come in here?
Sorry. So I've had participants where we've needed to use the distress protocol, and participants who've cried and like visibly distressed during the interview. And I think that like how you kind of continue with the interview, how you probe into things like I've interviewed with Sister Kiletso, who's done a lot of interviews. And I think we have like slightly different approaches. Like I've seen how she'll kind of steer away when something makes the participant cry, she'll steer away from that. Whereas I think for me, because that's kind of what the point of the interview is in my research projects, is to understand what is upsetting them or what is difficult. And also from the counseling kind of background, that's the thing that I'll probe into. But I think it's very important that it's done very carefully. And in some cases, like I had quite a nice interview where by the end of the interview, she seemed quite like she cried during the interview. And at the end, she seemed like quite happy because we'd kind of talked about what was difficult, and she had figured out what she needed to do to address the things that were difficult for herself, which was really nice to see that happen in an interview as well, like to see somebody get that out of it, which isn't always the case. Like sometimes it is more helpful, like with some people, they're like, no, I want to see a psychologist or whatever, and then we just refer them to that. And I'm not sure whether they end up going or not because, you know, it's a separate department in the hospital.
Yeah, I guess that's always the tricky bit, is one can refer and you never know for sure. But also coming to what you're saying, I think it links quite nicely with the points at the end of the slide around needing to have emotional experience and skill, and tuning into when distress is needing referral and when it's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah, so thanks for that, Siobhan. I think that's really important. But yeah, how does one get to this point where you have this kind of skill? And I think, you know, Siobhan, your own journey has involved actually going and learning counseling skills, you know, which I think has put you in a tremendously strong place as a researcher compared to if you hadn't gone through that process. And a lot of people don't have counseling skills when they do qualitative research. So how do we navigate the sensitivities of emotion? Yeah, very tricky. I liked what they said about listening with the head and the heart. And yeah, I guess that's the bit about tuning in and knowing when to push a bit more or when to back off. And I like the examples that they gave of sometimes explicitly asking a participant, are you happy for us to continue? Or else just pausing and waiting and seeing what happens. So some of those examples from real interviews were really useful, I thought. So they talk about after the interview and the lingering effects of emotional disclosure. So thinking even about aspects like, how do you store this material? Do you have follow-up communication with the participant? Do you send the transcript back to them? Do you create rapport and protect their privacy but facilitate agency? How do you navigate those tensions as well around relationship? And they talked a lot about the need for an ongoing consent process. So this was interesting to me. So actually signing consent after the interview rather than before, because then that gives the person an opportunity to withdraw. But then I guess that's the risk as a researcher of losing data. You've done all this hard work and then the person says, no, you can't use it, I'm not giving consent.
But also if you're working cross-linguistically, I feel like the power dynamic is bigger then at the end. Absolutely. Now you've told me your lovely story, now please sign that I can use it for my own purposes, as opposed to sort of explaining it up front.
Yeah. It's that trust thing, isn't it? It's trust part and create the trust, because you know the other thing that also struck me about the suicidal intent, you didn't cause that. in the
Yeah.
interview.
Yeah.
It was there already.
Yeah.
It was uncovered in the interview. And I think that that's also a distinction that we should make,
Yeah.
is that we're not causing the distress. We might be unpacking it, we might be
Sure.
revealing it.
Or
But
might
there
be
was
even
something-
providing a space, you know,
Yeah.
for them to feel comfortable enough to bring it there,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah, which they wouldn't have shared otherwise.
But the interview didn't make him suicidal. And I think that that's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
important for us to take on. Otherwise, I
Yeah.
think we'd be
We sit with
wrecked.
it.
Yeah. Walking around feeling, yeah.
We just go back to surveys and quant research. Yeah. Yeah. Siobhan, do you want to jump in here?
I think it comes back to this thing of like consent being an ongoing process. Like I don't think it is like a once-off thing. But I have also had people like where, you know, I'm asking them, do they want to participate? And then I explain what it's about, and they say, no, I don't want to do this. And I think that they, you know, like registering that they might not be able to, you know, cope with whatever emotional stuff comes up. And I don't ask them why. Because usually if they're saying they don't want to talk about it, I'm like, okay, that's kind of leave it there, you know. But I assume that it's around that. It's around like, you know, okay, no, I don't feel comfortable talking about these things, where I feel like it might bring up something that I don't feel equipped to deal with, or you know, like I think I agree with Rona that we're eliciting and unpacking the trauma. We're not creating it.
Yeah, I think that's such an important distinction to make there. Coming back to this consent process, I think I would also prefer a process type approach. So, Megan, I think when we wrote that article on the tensions around your project, I think we suggested consent at the beginning and then consent afterwards as well. That you actually do multiple consents to give an opportunity for people to know upfront what you're doing in the project. And then afterwards to decide, do I really want to be part of this? And then they add a suggestion here around sending the transcript, which again offers the opportunity for them to withdraw, or else to perhaps be selective in what is included in the analysis. Yeah. So ethical safeguards, they also talked about doing a self-interview, which was something really new to me. But as someone who's participated in a couple of research projects recently, it's been really interesting to think around. And I'd encourage anybody to do that. If you have an opportunity to participate and be on the other side, do that, because it really shifts a lot of perspective in terms of what we do and how we do it and how it makes us feel. So doing a self-interview or getting somebody else to interview you on this topic that you're exploring, and gives you more awareness of assumptions, gives you a lived experience of the emotions and the feelings that are evoked. And they talk about the ways in which ghosts of other people haunt the interview room, which I thought was so profound. So, you know, often there are things going on or memories triggered that can be really heavy and unexpected. And thinking about the dance of revealing and protecting. So how much information do I give, or what do I hold back on, but what does it all trigger? So interview follow-up as well, it's quite a nice idea. They suggest to follow up with the participant and ask them how they feel, contact them again if they've shown some kind of distress. And then also to ask about motivations for participating. That's quite an interesting one, because I think that can give a lot of insight into where they are at emotionally, or the reasons why they feel they want to share. So if they say, well, I've had an experience that I think would be worth sharing, that's quite different to, oh, I just think you're a nice lady or a nice guy, and I'm going to say yes to help you. Yeah. And certainly some of the projects that we've done around consent and people's motivations for participating in clinical trials have been very, very interesting, and quite a range of rationales. It's not always altruistic. Often it's Megan, I'm thinking of the TB study, the TB clinical trial, where for some people they participated to find a girlfriend. Literally.
Do you remember that?
Yes. There was no altruism there, nothing but
wasn't on the drop down.
yeah, exactly. They thought they'd
No,
find a girlfriend somewhere at the clinical trial site. True story.
not expected data. Not
No,
an
no,
expected data finding.
no. So thinking about also in the interview, what are the immediate effects of distress and what are the lasting legacies? So those thought processes that might be triggered either in a positive or a negative way. Yeah.
No, I'm just thinking, you know, I mean, we're laughing about wanting to find a girlfriend, but maybe it also speaks to like finding people who are in a similar situation who you can connect with in the context of stigma and
Absolutely.
whatever. If I think about some of the research that's been done with parents of children with cerebral palsy and Down syndrome,
True.
and it's to connect. It's more to connect, especially when it's focus groups,
Yeah.
rather than to contribute to research.
Absolutely. That's a very valid point. Yeah. Yeah. That it's that connection is often so much more powerful than any sort of altruistic. Yeah. And then they talk about this concept of reciprocity, which is not always tangible, but again, understanding motivations for participating, and some kind of personal affirmation that somebody might be seeking, or a cultural affirmation. So like an affirmation of collective community experience or understanding, and how to reframe that through a research project, which might be quite useful. I was thinking back to that the article we did a few months ago on some of the colonial aspects of probing difficult stories and traumatic experiences, and how communities sometimes have responded to these sort of TV exposés of how awful it is to live on an Indian reservation kind of thing. And reframed it as, you know, this is what it's like to be a Native American, and this is actually what our reality is. And so the response and the reciprocity has been very important in those studies. Yeah, so just to kind of draw some threads together here, I think what they say is quite important here, that interviews are not therapy, but there's a lot of emotional work that goes on in an interview that we need to be aware of and need to think about and prepare for as best we can in terms of how we navigate that. So needing to know how to respond when confronted with a narrator's suffering, protecting from harm when emotions arise, and leaving narrators feeling cared for, respected, and that they've contributed to something that encompasses but is also much larger than their individual narratives. So again, maybe doing a bit more explaining about what I'm actually doing with this project, or what Carl suggested around inviting relationship as well, and making that really explicit so that participants know they can follow up, they can contact you. They don't need to sit there and suffer with lingering legacies of emotion and distress. Yeah. And then they had I had a couple of questions here just to kind of leave us with some thought and some issues to think about. So does increased intimacy risk blurring the boundary between researcher and caregiver/friend? So when we invite that relationship, are we actually opening a door too wide? How do we navigate that in a appropriate way? Thinking about some of the practical and ethical limitations of reciprocity. So this concept of the narrator or the participant also getting something out of the research relationship. And then thinking about the strategies that they proposed, what do you feel might be most lacking in your own research practice, or what is something that you would like to try and do, having read and discussed this article? So I'm happy to hear any thoughts from anyone around what you might want to do differently, or any thoughts around some of the other questions here. Santo, I see you are typing. I don't know if you want to chip in.
No, it was just I'm reminding the online participants to please drop their HPCSA number. Sorry.
I'm waiting for something
Yeah.
profound here. Carl, do you want to come in here?
Thanks. Yeah. So the first question is really so interesting. The issue between distinguishing boundaries and intimacy, or in terms of like the way I always think about it is when you open the door to somebody else and you learn about them or you become aware of them, you've crossed the line. Like you can't return from that. Like you can't, when you've heard something about somebody suffering, because you're human, you also suffer in a sense. Like there is no, the protection is almost like an illusion. But the boundaries are really important. Like at which point then do you now start becoming over, you know, or assume things about your relationships that now, okay, now I'm the one who must now help, or I must now reach out more, and that can be intrusive and wrong. But like I find it so interesting that we have to confront the fact that when we step into the interview room, whether as a clinician or researcher, you've crossed the line. Like you can't protect yourself necessarily. I don't know, maybe people don't agree, but I feel like that's something we have to face. And that brings out a whole lot of issues then for us as researchers, because we want something out of it and we want it to be scientific and all that. But it's always a mixture of this relationship aspect. That's just my sense. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. So this concept of reciprocity and what are they getting out of it versus what am I getting out of it, I think is so key to think about. Yeah. Sure.
Something that also stood out for me quite a bit is that as much as we need to reflect on this, I really enjoyed also the discussion about how do we scaffold and guide our students and help them to also develop these skills, because I'd never, until some people mentioned it, yeah, like we often think about these things for us in our research. And for me, I never thought about, okay, how do I actually guide my students, especially being a new kind of research supervisor and whatnot. So like I really liked how this also then has brought up questions of how do you support and guide your students in thinking about these things if they are doing, even if they're not doing, like I was just thinking one of my students is doing a topic on health-seeking behaviors for people who have had voice disorders, but sometimes that can still trigger.
Well, that's exactly what Sally is doing, is health literacy.
Yeah. You know, so like just to then how do I guide and how do I walk with my student to help her with situations that might arise that are tricky that we don't anticipate. So I think that would be very helpful as well as a supervisor, not just a researcher. So yeah.
Self-reflection.
Yeah.
Was Thoreau the philosopher who said that the single greatest human need is to be appreciated? And you know, when you think about it, that feels like a bit like, really? But I think if you look at it in the context of why qualitative work works and people are prepared to participate, I think it does speak to that, is to be appreciated in terms of your experience.
And I have something to contribute. Yes,
and
absolutely.
That has to come across quite strongly in an interview. And I think that students get that wrong because they're thinking about what they should be doing right or wrong. So they've got the script in this head and this voice going, you're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong, you're going to mess up. And instead of actually looking at the person in front of them and appreciating their story. And I think that that's what makes a really good researcher. Is if you take yourself and your needs and your ego out of it and look at exactly what the person is giving you and honor that.
Absolutely.
And I think that's extremely difficult.
Sure. Yeah. So thinking about issues around reciprocity, appreciation, trust, relationship. Yeah. There's a lot here. Connection as well was something that came up. Sure. So I feel like we could keep discussing this for another hour, but it really has been such a deep, meaningful way to end of the year. And and yeah, so many ethical challenges here. So I'm thinking I actually might want to put this article into our ethics guidelines, because it really does have so much for potential researchers, or researchers embarking on a project to think about, and definitely something we need to be training our students more explicitly in these skills. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining. I'm hoping that our next session, I think, will probably be around February. Yeah, I know. So we're going to take a break December, January. But yeah, I look forward to more discussions around qualitative methods. This has been a fantastic forum and just so much learning and growing and sharing. So thank you all for participating. I think this has been one of our best, most interactive discussions. So really great. And thanks everybody. For those of you who I won't see before February, I hope you have a good festive season. Good luck for this end of the year, hectic time. Yeah, and we will chat further. So all the best and thanks for joining. Bye.
Bye bye. Thanks.